Get ready. You're listening to Give God 90 live.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
Welcome everyone to Give God 90. I almost said radio on demand, but we are live on Thursday night. I get used to doing that when I'm doing my thing, and it's just the introduction that I use. So we're live on Thursday night. My name's Jerry Mitchell. My other half, lovely bride, wonders why I smile now for some reason. Myra. There is a little joke to that. Not really a joke, but I sat down I had finished lunch. You were sitting there eating, and I sat down and smiled. And she gave me this weird look. And I said, well, can't I sit and smile at you? She goes, no. So, we do that, I guess, sometimes. As we get our introductions going here this evening, I don't want to forget. I had somebody sent me a message that said, you need to mention the website more because you're not mentioning the website enough. So don't forget to go to www.givegod90.com, and that's where you get all the freebies. There are links to other stuff, but that's where all the free stuff is. The other stuff includes the books. The other stuff includes the pictures. Do we have anything else? I don't think so. Anyway, there's
your YouTube channel.
The YouTube, I haven't linked that yet, but okay. I also need to put a link to Messianic Delaware because there's a lot of stuff on there that you might be interested in. Anyway, for tonight, YouTube's up and running. Oh, YouTube, my goodness. Facebook is up and running. Chat is open on Spreaker for my Spreaker folks live. Now, there's a lot of people that listen to this later when they choose to listen to it, and that's a good thing because they can get it whenever they want. Right. That's always fun, which is why I call the Mondays that I do radio on demand, because you can listen to it when it's convenient for you. You're not locked into a live thing like people are here tonight. I know there's a lot of people that probably won't be listening tonight because they're out doing their thing, and they can work that out in fear and trembling, as I put that out earlier. So, there you are. The other thing I want to mention for an ever-growing group of people, the new folks, is you can download the Give God 90 app. It gives you access to the Spreaker podcasts, and I want to make sure that everybody knows about that. You can download them. You can listen to them through the archives, search them, do all kinds of stuff. So it's all there. Was there anything else I was supposed to mention before we get started? I don't think so. Okay.
I think you covered everything.
That's good. So as long as I can get to everything, I'm kind of happy. Last week, something I mentioned obviously stirred some people up. And usually we have more folks listening in by now, but I don't see anybody. But that's okay. They can listen to it later. They'll watch us on reruns, as I think it was Carol said, which is really odd. I never thought I'd be on reruns, but that was the name that somebody gave when they watched the live broadcast later. So there we go. Something we talked about last week stirred a couple people up because I got an email and a message that said, don't you realize we're under grace? Paul said it, right? That's
He
the way
did.
it's translated.
Wonder grace.
And I said, do you know what grace is? They didn't have an answer for me.
Okay.
So I have to then assume that not everybody out there who should have read my second book, God's Universe, God's Rules, has read it, because if you read it, you would know what grace is, and you wouldn't ask me that question to start with. Anyway, so for the folks out there who haven't read that, here's a freebie. We're going to talk about grace. And the verse that most people refer to is found in Romans 6:14. It says, "For sin shall no longer be your master, because you are not under the law, but under grace." It's a verse that gets a lot of people in trouble, because they'll take that one verse and they'll build a doctrine around it. And I very sarcastically said earlier this week, I think it was to you and a couple of other people, it's probably a good thing that they didn't build a doctrine around and he went out and hanged himself. I don't think you'd get a lot of followers if that was your doctrine. So, I understand where it's coming from. You want people to follow you, right? You want to be liked. So you take this and you say, look at what we can do with this one verse. And they're twisting Paul's words. Paul is a self-proclaimed zealot for the law, which means at a very early age, probably 17 or 18, he had the first 5 books of our Old Testament, the books of Moses that Moses wrote, memorized. How many books of the Bible do you have memorized?
None.
Okay. I don't either. I know where to find stuff. I know where it typically is going to be. But to be able to pull it up verbatim out of my head, I can't, because I don't limit myself to one translation. Paul didn't have that problem. What he heard and understood was all in the same language. Mm-hmm. He understood it all in plain Hebrew. He had it together. He didn't have all these other translations that we have to deal with. So Paul's getting this stuff. He knows what the law is. He knows what grace is. He knew the culture. He knew the history. And he's explaining Hebraic culture and Hebraic history to people in other cultures, like the Romans and the Corinthians and the Colossians and the Ephesians, and he's explaining this to those folks.
Hi, Pam.
Hi, Pam. And when Paul says, you have to be all things to all people, he's not talking about changing who he is to be like somebody else. What he's saying is, I've got to explain things to the Romans differently than I'm going to explain them to the Ephesians. I've got to explain things differently to the Ephesians than I'm going to talk to the Colossians. And he's going to explain things to Timothy differently still. Mm-hmm. He's going to say the same thing. He's not changing what he's saying. He's just changing how he's saying it. You wouldn't speak to a 5-year-old the same way you're going to speak to a 10-year-old. Hopefully, if you're going to teach a 5-year-old math, right? Mm-hmm. You thought I was going somewhere else. If you're going to teach a 5-year-old math, you're going to go 1 + 1 = 2. Mm-hmm. If you're going to do something with a 10-year-old, you're going to, hi, Tina. You're going to explain it differently than you are to that 5-year-old. If you're going to talk to a 15 or 16-year-old, then you can start talking calculus, calculaic expressions. That's a big word, ain't it?
Right. Hi, Carol.
So Paul's saying you do the same thing when you're explaining Hebrew culture and Hebrew concepts to these Greek and Roman people. Mm-hmm. You have to explain it so that they can understand it. We look at it today and say, well, he's contradicting himself, but he's not. Paul never contradicts himself. He never... Say it, good deal.
Hi.
He never, ever backs down on what he starts to say. He never changes it. If you think there's a contradiction in the Bible, you need to rethink. Contradiction is not in the Scriptures. Contradiction belongs to us. We own it. And it's our responsibility to track that down and figure out why we think it contradicts itself, because it doesn't. From Genesis to Revelation is one message, usually repeated over and over and over again, but it's one message. Paul knew exactly what grace was, he knew what the law was, and he knew how to explain it to the different groups of people that he was talking to. It's not a New Testament concept. A lot of people don't understand that. If you go to the Strong's, you're going to find out what the word is, and sometimes the Strong's won't tell you the first time it's used, though. You have to actually search that out a different way. But the first time it's used is actually in Genesis 6:8. It says, Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Back in Genesis, we see grace mentioned. Quite often, too, by the way. You just have to know how to find it. Now, if you want to grab your Bible and look up Deuteronomy 24, this is going to be fun. Because now we get to see a play on words. 24:1.
Suppose a man takes a wife and marries her. Now, if she doesn't find favor in his eyes because he has found something indecent in her, he is to write her a certificate of divorce, hand it to her, and send her out from his house.
Now, why in the world would I pick that verse? Hi, Sean. Why in the world would I pick
Hi, Sean.
that verse to talk about grace? Did you read grace in that verse?
No, but I know where you're going. Because you've done this.
I've talked about this before. Let me read. This is coming from the JPS 1917. It says, if a man takes a wife and she fails to please him because he finds something obnoxious about her, he is to write her a bill of divorcement, hand it to her, and send her on her way. That, obnoxious, indecent, sometimes it's called unclean. If you go back and you look in the Hebrew, you're going to find a very strange word. It's called nakedness. Not like in Genesis 3:11 where, God says, who told you were naked? Without clothes, right? Mm-hmm. This is different. This is other places translated as undefended. It's also the same word for naked used when they went into Noah's tent and found him naked. It means that something is not right. It doesn't necessarily mean nude, without clothes. What it implies is a condition where something is, and it can be more than just a little wrong. It means it's often terribly wrong. When they used it in Noah, chapter 9, what that particular word leads a lot of people to believe, and I kind of lean that way now, is that Ham went in first and performed an operation on his father that left him unable to have any more children. Mm. Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the three brothers, and in Ham's eyes, he was getting ready to divide the world three different ways. One family was going to rule this part, one family was going to rule that part, another family was going to rule another part. He didn't want fourth because that was a smaller cut for him, right? Mm-hmm. And they certainly didn't want any more than that. So, Shem walks in and says, something ain't right. Mm-hmm. Something just is very, very wrong here. So there's a whole other teaching about that I'm going to get into right now. When we think about the words that are used, this is very important. This is a really good example of why you have to search these words out. Because if you read it in English, it doesn't make any sense. But if a woman finds no favor in her husband's eyes, what would cause that? You got to think about culture, and this was written 4,000 years ago, almost. So the culture 4,000 years ago, the woman's not going to sit around watching reality TV and eating bonbons all day, right?
No.
The betrothal, the engagement portion could last up to a year. In that time, men are trained to be men, women are trained to be women, differently than what we see later. And by the way, when you were at therapy the other day for your shoulder, I recorded for Monday, which won't be released on Facebook Live. It will be only on Spreaker and distributed through Spreaker and everywhere it goes. How the changing role of women in the Bible, and I look at part of this and how women were looked at differently in Genesis than they are in the Gospels and in Paul's letters. Big change. Know exactly when it happened, know exactly where it came from. We can trace it back through the Scripture. So keep that in mind for Monday. These people back then, they didn't have the distractions we have today. They knew their roles very well. They knew what to do. They knew how to come together. They knew exactly what was going to happen. If a woman really was not a good wife, let's just put it that way, there was no getting around it. It was the husband's duty to correct that or to send her on her way. Mm-hmm. But if the husband was not being a good husband, what did the wife have to do? The wife had to remove grace from the home. Mm-hmm. And he either got his act together or he wrote her a bill of divorce. And it had to be, it wasn't just a one-sentence thing either. It was a contract. Mm-hmm. And not to make a Jewish joke here, but it was a Hebrew contract, very detailed, so that the next person that met this woman, she could show him and say, look, this is what happened. This is why we are no longer together. Mm-hmm. It would actually probably make a lot of our divorce decrees in the United States today look short, mm-hmm. because it had to be detailed. That was basically her way of filing for divorce. Solomon very wisely said, it's probably better to live on the corner of the roof than to live in the house with an obstinate woman. Wise man, Solomon was. He's saying, and he's not saying write her a bill of divorce and get rid of her. He's saying straighten yourself out. In that proverb is exactly what he's saying. But this was the way that she could remove grace from the home, and it was her way of either healing that marriage or being free, depending on how bad of a husband he was. Mm-hmm. Christians today, they like to consider themselves the bride of Christ, right?
Right.
Has the groom in this situation done anything to deserve the bride removing grace?
No.
Has the bride in this situation messed up bad enough that we deserve, mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
Deserve hanging.
Think about that for a while, folks, because that's just how serious mm-hmm. this is in the eyes of the Almighty. Let's go on to Psalm 84. And this actually comes from your Tree of Life version. For Adonai Elohim is a sun, S-U-N, and a shield. Adonai gives grace and glory. There it is, spelled out, plain and simple. But David doesn't stop there. He keeps on going. He says, no good thing will he withhold from those who walk uprightly. More on that in a little while. Let's go back to Proverbs. You want to read Proverbs 3, 1, 2, 3, and 4.
My son, my law forget not, and my commands let thy heart keep. For length of days and years, life and peace they do add to thee. Let not kindness and truth forsake thee. Bind them on thy neck, write them on the tablet of thy heart, and find grace and good understanding in the eyes of God and man.
So there we see again that this thing that we think of as grace comes from the Almighty, right? He's the one who provides it. There's a lot more examples, but you get the idea, I hope. Grace comes directly from our Creator. It's impossible for Him to run out of it. It's this thing called God math that I call it. You know, it's like when God reaches into a bucket and pulls something out, the bucket never gets empty. He just keeps giving it. Now, grace is hard to explain until you think about it as not being a noun. Little bit of grammar here, okay? When I looked it up in Noah Webster's 1828 dictionary, he has like 9 different definitions where he tries to explain it and he doesn't get there because he's trying to explain it as a noun. Remember, Hebrew is a very active language. Even something as simple as a blue crayon, is thought of not as that little 3-inch long wax cylinder that you write with. It's thought of in the process of what can I do with it? What can I color with it? Can I write with it? Can I accomplish something with it? What can be accomplished with this item? Grace is the same way. It's actually an active, action-forming noun. And I know that sounds crazy to a lot of grammar teachers out there. Just deal with it because we're talking about something in a foreign language and a foreign culture that is difficult for us to understand. It's the best way I know to explain it to someone who is only speaking English. Now, if you happen to have been one of the few people who read God's Universe, God's Rules, you're going to know this next part. But what I want you to think about is energy. And for a lot of people, we think about energy, when we plug something in and we turn the switch on. Okay, that's energy, right? There's something that flows through whatever we're using. And we can turn the switch on and off. We can turn the volume up and down. We can, do all kinds of things to control the item, but we can't control the energy because we can't hold the energy. If we try to hold electric, bad things are going to happen to you. Just trust me. It's not pleasant. You're going to be shocked or electrocuted or worse. If we think of it in terms of like gasoline, we can pour gasoline into a container. We can hold it. We can see it. We can smell it. We pour that into an internal combustion engine, right? Start it up. And we can control whatever the engine's running, whether it's a car or a motorcycle or a chainsaw or a lawnmower. It doesn't matter what it is. But we can't hold that energy in our hand. Now, gasoline hurts us as well, right? We certainly can't drink it. It will kill you. There is, however, one molecular structure that our bodies are willing to absorb all the time. And that molecular structure in the form of sugar, whether it's fructose, glucose, or sucrose, the cells in your body, your Creator designed them to absorb that because they look at it and say, oh, that's energy. I'm going to use that later. You're going to use it later when you get up out of bed, when you get up out of your chair, when you play with your children, your grandchildren, when you're playing a musical instrument, walking a crowd down the street, whatever it is, that sugar is absorbed by your cells. You can't touch that energy, but you can use that energy. Okay? Grace is spiritual energy. It's kind of like spiritual sugar. It's always, your soul, your spirit is always ready to absorb grace. Okay. And it uses that grace in a very special way. Because grace is what we have to live a upright or a righteous life in a fallen world. Grace is the energy that we have that we can function, we can do the things, we are able to live the way we're designed, even though the world around us says you can't do that. Okay? So now that we have a better understanding of what grace is,
Yes, Jay, we
yeah.
can do that.
so now that we have a better understanding of what grace is, maybe we need an understanding of what sin is. Because if we're living a upright or a righteous life in a fallen world, then we're not sinning, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's pretty easy. And actually, even the International Children's Bible gets this. This comes from 1 John 3:4. The International Children's Bible. Something simple to understand. I like this version. When a person sins, he breaks God's law.
It's short and sweet.
It doesn't
and hard
stop
to
there. It doubles down. Hey, Daryl, good to see you.
Hey, Daryl.
He doubles down on this. He says, when a person sins, he breaks God's law. Yes, sinning is the same as living against God's law. And then from the NLV, the person who keeps on sinning is guilty of not obeying the law of God, for sin is breaking the law of God. So you still think we live under grace? Do you think it's possible for, after we read, Psalms and Proverbs, is it possible to live in such a way that we're going to be receiving God's grace if we're not doing the things He's telling us to do? If we're not following His instructions, exactly right.
Mm-mm.
Paul writes we live under grace to remind us that we have the energy and the authority not to sin. Let's visit Romans 6 again. This time, beginning in verse 15. The last one, Jay, was verse 14. I'm going to do Romans 6:15 through 18. Paul writes, "What then? Shall we sin because we're not under the law but under grace? By no means." Now, he writes earlier, right, in verse 14, "For sin shall no longer be your master because you're not under the law but under grace." Very next verse, folks. "What then? Shall we sin because we're not under the law but under grace? By no means. Don't you know that when you offer yourselves to someone as obedient slaves, you're slaves to the one you obey, whether you're slaves to sin or whether you're slaves to sin, which leads to death, or to obedience, which leads to righteousness." Now, there's a word I've used a couple of times. Verse 18, though, "You have been set free from sin and have become slaves to righteousness." So what's righteousness? If the Bible's self-defining, it's got to be in there somewhere, right? Yeah?
Yeah.
All right. Deuteronomy 6:25. "And righteousness it is for us when we observe to do all that is commanded before Jehovah our God, as He has commanded us to do." Does that change some folks' mind, I wonder?
I hope so.
What Paul is literally telling the Romans is this: you're not a slave to violating the law, but you have grace, which gives you the desire and the energy to keep the Creator's instructions. That's what he's saying. Now, there is a lot being taught about grace, especially these days, that is wrong. It's bad, and people are making a lot of money on it. One person in particular, he has several books out now. He has children's cartoons, and a bunch of other stuff. But it's really, what he's teaching is you can do whatever you want to do. You can continue to live the lifestyle you wanted to live because, you have grace. We've always had grace available to us. Mm-hmm. Noah had grace available to him.
You've got to earn it.
Well, you don't have to earn it. You have to accept it.
Accept it.
You can't, grace is kind of like salvation. You can't earn it,
Sure.
but it's always available. You just have to reach out and take it. Mm-hmm. But you can't reach out and take it if you're not living the lifestyle that allows you to be in the place where you can take it. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Let's look at Jude 4. Jude only has one chapter, so I don't have to say Jude 1:4, right? Mm-hmm. All right. For there are several men crept in unaware, who were before of old ordained to this condemnation, ungodly men, turning the grace of our God into lasciviousness and denying the only Lord God and the Lord Jesus Christ. Now, there's some big words in there, right? Mm-hmm. You have to understand what lasciviousness is. It's excessive indulgence of liberty. It's license. It's a license. You can do whatever you want. Basically, what they're saying is you've been given a license to sin because you're under grace. Jude's saying, no, you're not. He says, there's some people in here, and what they're teaching, you're right, Jay, it's always been offered. Jude's saying, there's people that are coming in, they are not godly people. Absolutely not godly people. And they're perverting the grace that God has given into something that it is not. Again, from the International Children's Bible. Some people have secretly entered your group. They've snuck in. Mm-hmm. Some people call it wolves in sheep's clothing. They're not even wearing the sheep's clothing anymore. They have already been judged guilty for the things they are doing. They've already been judged. The Almighty knows what's going on. Long ago, the prophets wrote about these people. They are against God. They have used the grace of our God in the wrong way to do sinful things. They refuse to accept Yeshua, our only Messiah. You know, there's a lot of times, and I have talked about folks like this before. I used to know a pastor. He was a heck of a nice guy. He's a really, really nice guy. But he had this thing he called New Testament Christianity. And he didn't need the Old Testament. Problem is, here's the problem, okay? You cannot live in a house without a foundation. If you bring somebody into church and the church, for some reason they hear something and they say, I need to start following God, and the church hands them a Gospel of John and says, come back next week and write us a check, you've just given a person like a bundle of shingles who has no house to put it on. They're not going to understand it. And literally, the entire Gospel of John uses the Feast of Passover to show who Yeshua is to the other Jews. And you're going to give it to somebody who has no understanding? Hosea 4:6 says that my people are destroyed for the lack of knowledge. If you don't have what's the foundational knowledge, like Paul did, you're not going to have a roof. You're not going to need a roof because you don't have a foundation to build a house on to put a roof on, right?
Right.
So all of that comes together. If you're not going to be there, if you're not really willing to accept righteousness as your master, Paul said, you don't need to be under grace. You don't deserve to be under grace. If you're not willing to change what you're doing, if you're not willing to, as Yeshua put it, repent, for the kingdom is at hand, Paul says, ain't happening. David said in, where did I put that one? Psalm 84:11. Adonai gives grace and glory. No good thing will he withhold from those who walk uprightly. That particular word right there has been translated as righteous. So think about this. Think about this very seriously. If you think that you can continue to live a sinful lifestyle because we're under this thing called grace, you need to go back and re-examine that. Because I know that somebody you trusted very much probably told you that at some point in time. They probably had been deceived as well. Jeremiah 16 says that our fathers have been deceived. and they passed it down and passed it down, and look where we are today. Don't get caught up in this. There's something I'm going to do that I usually don't do, but because of what we're talking about, I think this will tie everything together. Many of you are familiar with the Aaronic benediction, even though you might not know it. Right?
Right.
You know, most churches today, it doesn't matter what denomination, at some point in time you're going to hear, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you, right? Mm-hmm. That's how many churches end their services. I'm going to tweak that for you. Here's the thing. The Almighty himself spoke to Aaron and he said, you put my name, not my title, not how you think of me, but my name on the people. And here's how you say it. Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and do this.
Both ways?
Both ways. Okay? Aaron steps out in front of the people. He raises his hands. And he said, Yivareka ka Yehovah v'yishmereka. Yair Yehovah panav elecha v'chunaka. Yisa Yehovah panav elecha v'yasem lecha shalom. And the people understood what that meant. Today, let me give you another way to think about this. May Yehovah bless you and guard you. May Yehovah lift his eyes towards you and offer you an abundance of grace. May the light of Yehovah's face shine brightly on you and remove all of the chaos, all of the drama, and all of the garbage that causes you unrest. That's how important grace is. He wants you to live with enough grace so that you have the energy to do that. Ladies and gentlemen, it has been a sheer pleasure to have you join us today.
Yes,
we
it
thank
is.
you all. You're right, Jay. That's what the whole thing was all about. That's what got me started on this. You know, I wish there was a way to the folks on Facebook could see the folks on Spreaker, but that just doesn't happen. And I'm sorry, but I don't always get the opportunity to watch both screens at the same time. So please don't feel disconnected, okay? But although we are going to disconnect right now, we certainly are thankful for you guys that have listened today. Please like us, share us. This message needs to get out because this one especially is important. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful week. Until next time, shalom.
Shalom.